You can't miss it. So understand that's where that comes into play. And again, so much history, as I said, that you start breaking down once you understand just this part in these stories. So the whole Seleucid Empire came about because Seleucus was one of the commanders that killed Perdiccas, one of the first, or considered the first Diadochi successor of Alexander the Great. And so the successor, the Diadochi War, began. And once Perdiccas was killed, of course, you had Eurydice pushing for her husband, to be in power, to get more powers. And a lot of people thought that might happen, but of course it didn't, because of course he was slow and they didn't want to give him anything he really couldn't handle. So what happened was you had one of Philip of Macedonia, Alexander's father. You had one of his old lieutenants basically end up being voted in as being the new regent. So now Perdiccas is dead, and you have one of the lieutenants of Philip of Macedonia taking over as the regent. Now you would think, with Philip being, so old and dying a long time ago, anybody who served with him would be old. So Antipater, who was the lieutenant who served with Philip of Macedonia, he became regent. Now, he wasn't regent for long because he died of natural causes, soon after. So everybody assumed that his son, Cassander, would take the place as regent. Because again, that's how things usually go. Your son succeeds you, becomes your successor. And Cassander thought that he would take the place if something happened to his father. And you had Eurydice, and you had her husband, who was her uncle. Gonna keep pointing that out because it's crazy. You had Eurydice and her uncle, Philip III, basically pushed for Cassander to be the new regent of Macedonia. Cassander had already aligned himself with Ptolemy the First Soter and the other Diadochi, who was against Perdiccas. So, once he didn't get named ruler or regent, he was upset. Now, what happened was, instead of Cassander, son of Antipater, once he didn't get named, as I say, he was upset. A lot of people assumed he would get named. But what happened was you had Polypertian, who was a friend of Antipater, one of his friends. He got named as the regent because he was, closest to the king and he knew how to rule. And Cassander wasn't really looked at as a person who was really, ready to rule. So you had Polypertian take over as regent, which pissed Cassander off, and a civil war began between Polypertian and Cassander. And basically, Polypertian was shocked that Cassander amassed the type of warriors that he did, because of course he was in with Ptolemy the First Soter and the other Diadochi to basically, have this allegiance for one of them being, on the main throne. So when you look at the whole thing, you got to look at the seat of Alexander being the seat of power. So when you look at the 7 kingdoms in Game of Thrones, and you look at the fact that the Targaryen kingdom was like the main kingdom, they had the dragons, and they was the main kingdom over the 7 kingdoms and over really basically everything else. So whoever ruled that kingdom was considered, the ruler of the rest of the kingdoms. It's basically the same thing here in Greece. Whoever ruled Macedonia, whoever ruled the place in place of Alexander will be considered, the king of everything else. So they wanted it to be one of them, of course. So when you had Polypertian take over, Cassander go to war with him, and Cassander basically get help and have Ptolemy the First Soter and Antigonus, which Antigonus was the one who basically destroyed the fleet of Polypertian. You had them come together and basically help him defeat Polypertian, which he fled, and eventually Cassander would basically try to take the throne. So now Polypertian was smart. He basically fled to Olympus, whatever Alexander's mother's name, how do you pronounce it? Olympias. He fled to her, and he fled to Roxana and Alexander IV, who was Alexander the Great's son, who was the heir in waiting, So he fled there and basically pled to Olympias and said, hey, Cassandra's taking over. This isn't the way it's supposed to go. Basically help him out. And what Olympias did, because she was powerful as well, she could fight. She had an army, and he basically got together the men that he had left who was willing to fight for him, and they amassed the army. While Cassandra was away, they basically went back into Macedonia and defeated the army there and basically took back the kingdom. So you had Olympias going there. And remember, now you have Olympias there, but who's also there is Eurydice and Philip III, named after her husband. So she understood that Philip III was being used, and as long as he was alive, he was a threat to the kingdom. So he had to go. So she killed him. She had him executed, and she forced Eurydice to commit suicide. So Philip III of Macedonia was executed 317 BCE, and his wife Eurydice was forced to commit suicide, and Olympus basically assumed control of the kingdom for a while. And she was basically, going on a rampage and killing everybody who she thought was a threat. She killed Cassandra's brother, all of Cassandra's commanders and his soldiers that was there. She executed a lot of them. And, she basically held on to the place for a while, I think over a year, until she was basically ambushed. She was basically caught in a blockade in Pydna. And Cassandra caught her in a blockade and basically forced her to surrender. And he told her, if you surrender, then, you can keep your life. I'll let you live if you surrender. She surrendered. And of course, he didn't keep his word, but he ordered a bunch of soldiers to execute her, which they didn't do it. They didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to be known as the person that killed Alexander's mother. So that was tough. So what he did was he got the family members of all the people that she executed, got her enemies, got everybody together, and they stoned her to death. Stoned her to death. And now Cassandra understood the only people that was in the way of him taking the throne was Alexander's son, Alexander IV, and his mother Roxana. So what he did, I believe it was 309 BCE, when Alexander IV was 14 and getting ready to come into age of being crowned king, he had them both poisoned them both. And you can look at it just like in Game of Thrones when Joffrey, the boy king, was poisoned. It's the same thing. You had Alexander IV poisoned at like 14. I think Joffrey was like older, like 19, something like that in Game of Thrones. But this is where the story is coming from. It's the same thing. All this stuff is coming from the same place. And this is what they do. They know how to take stories and actual history and then manipulate them. Manipulate the stories and plagiarize the stories to create something that they want to put out. But it's important that you know the story, which is why I'm telling it, because it's important you understand what happened and the kind of things that was taking place within those kingdoms. So you can see how unstable things was. So it's crazy. So eventually, Cassandra would crown himself king and take the throne and would rule for a while. So now we go back and you look at the only person left, as I mentioned before, was Cleopatra. Cleopatra was left, and the only person left that somebody could marry that could tie them to the throne and have some kind of stake in being, a true ruler or a person that had some kind of true claim to the throne. So you had Cleopatra eventually accept a proposal from Ptolemy I Soter to marry. But before she can get married, she was caught by Antigonus and she was killed. So again, this stuff kept happening. You had these wars. Nobody wanted anybody to really lay claim to the throne of Alexander unless it was them. So it was going to always be a war. Even people who they thought they was allies, they was going to fight. It was always going to be a battle for that throne, because that throne would be the throne to rule the rest of the thrones. And they all knew that. So, you had, this time, what a lot of people don't realize about Hellenization, when you have these empires that's basically controlling, Egypt, the Middle East, Greece, so much land. This is the real Hellenization, because now you got all these Greeks in control of all of these kingdoms. And now they're spreading the language and the customs of the Greeks, which is why everybody spoke Greek around then. Everybody was speaking Greek because the Greeks ruled that whole area. Once you understand that, it's very easy for you to see how they could be the ones who created the Bible. It's not hard. See, the reason why the Hebrews are having trouble putting this together, as well as other Christians, is because they don't look at the history. They don't know what happened. When you understand that these people in the Seleucid Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Roman Empire, which will later come, because during this time, while the Greeks are fighting each other, you have the Romans, building and basically breeding these cock diesel warriors getting ready for battle, because they see that while y'all fighting against each other, we're going to step in and take over. At the same time, you have the Persian Empire regaining strength, looking at the same thing. The Greeks keep fighting each other, killing each other. We need to just go in there and take this stuff from them because they can't get together and appreciate what they have. But with Hellenization, this is what you have. You have all these Greeks in these territories taking over and instilling Greek language, laws and rules, or what have you. And it's very easy to see how they was able to do what they did. So we can see this stuff in the Bible, as we're going to get into. When you start to understand the stories and what took place, you have Antiochus II. Antiochus II was married to Laodice, and they got into war, of course, with the Ptolemies. Now, Antiochus II ruled Syria, and Antiochus, the first, or Antiochus was the one who discovered Antioch in Syria, what have you, different story. But they got into it with Ptolemy, or Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. You can say Ptolemy, I say Ptolemy, it's just a thing, but it's pronounced Ptolemy. But they got into a war, and basically to settle the war, Ptolemy agreed to give his daughter to Antiochus II, who was already married. It's like, how are you going to give me a wife when I got a wife already? But to keep things, peaceful, he gave up his daughter, Berenice. He gave up his daughter to Antiochus II. He divorced his wife, Laodice, married Berenice, with the understanding that whatever children that they had would eventually rule. So now Laodice and Antiochus II already had a child, Seleucus II. But now you can see that when you get into the story, when you understand that, and you start reading in Daniel, you can see where that story fits in Daniel. You can see what Daniel is talking about. So now when you read Daniel 11:6, it says, "And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come unto the king of the north to make an agreement," the agreement I just told you about. "But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begot her, and he that strengthened her in these times." So now it's talking about, as I said, the daughter of the king of the south, which would be Berenice. The king of the south would be Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. The king of the north would be Antiochus II. Now, when it's saying that she will not retain the power of the arm, now what happened was you had Berenice and Antiochus II actually end up having a child, which that child, according to the agreement that it's speaking about, will be the heir. So now, unfortunately for Berenice, once they had a child, it somehow made Laodice, who is his real wife, he and Laodice basically came back together. They got back together once that child was conceived, and once that child was born, it brought them two back together closer. And what Laodice ended up doing, she actually killed the child of Berenice and her husband, Antiochus II. She ended up killing the child and killing Berenice. So when it says, neither shall he stand, well, after that, he died. So now what's left is her and her son, Lucius II, that she had with Antiochus II. And it says, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begot her, and he that strengthened her in these times. So not only did Laodice kill, their son and Berenice, but she killed the midwives, not the midwives, but basically like her caretakers that basically brought her into this world and took care of her and raised her. She killed them as well. And we know her, Ptolemy II Philadelphus ended up dying. And, of course, who strengthened her was Antiochus II, and he ended up dying. And what happened later, as I said, Lucius II will take the throne along with his mother, Laodice. So you have it right in the Bible, and when you understand the history and what it's talking about the Ptolemies. Without me even getting too much into it, all you got to do is read Daniel and listen to what Daniel was talking about, and it's telling the story. It's talking about Darius. And the story, the whole thing in Daniel, starting into Daniel 11, is talking about the Ptolemies, it's talking about Alexander and everything that was going on during that time. Clear as day. But they just don't use the names. But when you know the story and you know the history, you can match it up and see exactly what they're talking about. Because you can't make this stuff up. You can't just put it in there. You have to somehow attach it to real history to where people can actually see it. People can actually, make a connection that will make the stuff seem legitimate. So even when you start seeing this stuff talking about the whole story and the agreement, and that, the king of the south and the king of the north, the king of the south's daughter will basically go up to the king of the north. I mean, not too many people will even understand that. What does that mean? What are you talking about? Who are you talking about? But when you understand that history and what we're talking about, then you know what they're talking about. So now you have Daniel 11:7 saying, but out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. So when it's saying out of the branches of her roots, it's talking about her own son, who will rise up in the king of the north, which will be in the kingdom of Antiochus II, and he shall prevail. It's giving you the Ptolemies, it's giving you Antiochus II, it's giving you this story of what happened in Greek history and is in the Bible. And it's hard for you to really understand it because they don't really put names. If they actually put the names in there, in Daniel, we would have understood this stuff for a long time. But instead, by them taking out Maccabees and taking out the whole deuterocanonical books, the whole Apocrypha, and us not getting this understanding, we are left to piece it together. So now, you're looking at all this history, and you're seeing what's going on with the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire with Antiochus II, and nothing about the Jews. Nothing about the Jews before the 4th century BCE. So when you start getting into this time where after Ptolemy had basically taken Alexander's body and began to basically the wars of the Diadochi, and you had this fighting going on, and during this whole time that we have Hellenization, that you hear nothing about any Jews or any Hebrews until after the 4th century BCE, when they began to establish this whole deception. And that's the thing, how you have this history being explained in this war that's going on. And during this time, the Hebrews or the Israelites supposed to have been doing their thing. But somehow in Israel, which Israel would be part of the Seleucid Empire during that time, nothing. So you would think that if they was God's chosen people and the Bible was true, what have you, they would not have been gone through what they went through during that time. And definitely the Greeks wouldn't be ruling Israel during that time. So that's the whole thing. And that's one of the things they don't really get into, is explaining the Greeks ruling. This is the part they really want to cover up the most. Because when you start to look at the real history, it's going to point straight to them. And you have to ask yourself that question, where's the Jews? Where's the Jews in all this thing? What's going on? That we're reading all these stories in this whole Game of Thrones, and the Jews don't come into play and no place. So you're going to read in First Maccabees about the persecution of the Jews and, all this stuff about the Jews. And it seems like, and this is like 2nd century BCE around this time when they started to put the stuff into place. And the only reason why they have this in Maccabees about the Jews is to, again, put themselves into history, to try to force themselves in there. So we know the only reason why it will be any problem with the Jews in that territory will be because any type of persecution will be because it's them trying to force Judaism on the Africans that was there. That's why they mention it, because it's well known that they didn't just, of course, lay down and take it. You had a war. You had these Africans go to war with the Greeks, of course, and they lost. And eventually, once, time set in and the people who was fighting the war is dead and gone or ran off, the people that's left, you indoctrinate them. And you do that by generation. So once you teach that first generation and they know it, they pass it down. It's the same thing they did to us later in slavery. Start passing down the information. It just became normal. So you have these Africans eventually accept being Jews, Hebrews, and begin to start passing this information down until eventually they will be completely, wiped out of Israel. Will only be a few left. And the ones that was really into the religion and had high places will go out and teach the religion to other Africans, and it was spread until the Arabs came and basically took over and forced everybody to scatter. And they would eventually take a lot of these Jews, a lot of these Africans, and convert them to Islam. It's the same type thing. So we had this Judaism push, and it fulfilled its agenda. Its purpose was fulfilled as far as getting the information out there and planting it and passing it down to not just African civilizations, but to the so-called the Arabs and the mixed Berber around that time, because there was a lot of mixing going on, and to create this whole fictitious, fake Judaism when the Arabs came in and began mixing with the Greeks. But, when you look at the war, we start to step back, we see that the Ptolemies would prevail and began to take over much of that territory. In fact, when you go to First Maccabees 11:13, it says, "Then Ptolemy entered Antioch and assumed the crown of Syria." So he wore both the crown of Egypt and the crown of Syria. Here you have it clearly mentioning Ptolemy's name. But remember, this is in First Maccabees, one of the Apocrypha books that is not in the King James Version that you probably have at church, unless you got an older version or you have a version where they specifically say that it has the Apocrypha put in. And a lot of people know that when you grew up, that common King James Version that we grew up with did not have the Apocrypha in it. And even if it did, we didn't know what the hell it was anyway. So when Ptolemy did rule both kingdoms, Egypt and Syria, we know what it says later. He was fighting against another Alexander, and he defeated him. Now Alexander fled into the Arab territories, and Arabs basically caught him and cut his head off and sent it back to the Ptolemies. But Ptolemy died like a couple of days later, like 3 days after that. And you had Demetrius take the throne, and again, war all over again. And you had this type of stuff happen over and over. So what would eventually happen, we know that Rome got their stuff together and basically went to war with Greece. I think it was about 49 BCE where Julius Caesar, began to rule. That happened in Rome, and Greece would join, had a whole Greco-Roman era. And so the stability, began to fall in place for the Romans and the Greeks. And to me, that was somebody with knowledge, understanding that they needed to focus more on the Africans and come together and stop fighting against each other, and understand how powerful we were and what we could do. So you had them come together. You had, during this whole time with the Diadochi War, you had Rome basically being ruled by Africans, being controlled by Africans, and eventually the Aryans would come in, and you had a dual system of Africans and Aryans, black and white people, ruling and living together fine, with no problem. And meanwhile, you had the leadership, whoever was there, plotting to take over and overthrow the African rulership in Rome, which is what they end up doing. Plain and simple. The barbarians took over, and as I said before, when Rome fell, and people say that's the reason why, we had the Dark Ages, because Rome fell, but no. Rome fell, and Rome falling was the fall of the African leadership in Rome, as I said, and the rise of the European powers. And they amassed an army large enough, and we don't even know if they really fought or if they was on each other's side the whole time. We don't really know. We just know they came together, the Greco-Roman era. And remember, the Romans continued Hellenization and let the Greeks stay in the positions that they was, and even had the Greeks write the New Testament. Remember, it's written in Greek. So, who knows what really happened? The Roman Empire could have been the Greek Empire the whole time. We don't know. We just got to go by the little breadcrumbs of history that they leave us. But when you use common sense, it kind of doesn't work out. But that's what happened. So we had, as I said before, the Roman Empire would rise. But during that time, the Persian Empire was gaining, steam, and would eventually go head to head with the Roman Empire after they had laid claim to the lands that they took. And that battle would last up into the 7th century AD or CE. And remember, as I said, ended in the status quo antebellum, with Islam being created after that. And we know that the Moors made a deal with them as well to basically take over these African territories. Because as I said, they had to turn their attention to the Africans, because after all this war and fighting that was going on, they turned and looked and saw kingdoms rise up in Africa. And Africans have wealth and knowledge. They fighting and killing each other for hundreds of years for this power, for these thrones, for this information. And here you have the Africans start popping up with kingdoms all over Africa with knowledge, making money, and doing amazing things. And they had to focus their self on us and come together to conquer and take what we had, so that we won't use the knowledge that was rightfully ours to establish a more powerful kingdom on the planet. Now understand, we had already outnumbered them like crazy. Our problem was we wasn't united, and they was. That's why we fell. Because they got their shit together and got united. We wasn't looking at it as a black-white thing. They was looking at it as a white thing, a power thing, and using that to their advantage as far as getting in positions, making themselves look weak and like they wanted to learn or what have you, and, being really good spies and moles. And it will eventually bring down many African kingdoms. So we're going to get into, of course, in part 3, we really got to get into the Roman Empire and their rise, and the Africans that ruled their territory, and how Christianity was instilled and brought up. So we'll get into that eventually. But it's important to understand the Ptolemaic era and what happened during that time. So again, you have to ask yourself, why would they leave this stuff out of the Bible? Why wasn't we taught this stuff, in history class? Why would they leave all these stories, this whole entire history that I just gave you? A lot of you don't know about, never heard of before. And the movies didn't tell it all and tell it like it was. Why would they leave it out? And of course, you got to look at the fact, as I showed you in Daniel, clearly talk about the Ptolemies and what happened. Don't use the names. But we know it's talking about the Ptolemies. But you got to think about it. Wasn't the Old Testament supposed to be written in Hebrew? Supposed to be written in Hebrew, right? Why is it Daniel is an Old Testament book? So it's supposed to be written by the Hebrews. Why would the Hebrews know that story? How would the Hebrews know that story to write it? Think about that. So they're supposed to have been there and witnessed all this stuff that I just talked about and put it in Daniel. The whole war against the king of the south, king of the north, the agreement. How would they know that? And of course, biblical people would say, well, the Lord told them that. So the Lord told them all that to write all that, but they somehow can't fit themselves in the story. So basically it was just some Hebrew or Jew around hiding, writing this stuff, or people going to believe that God gave them that story and told them to just write it out. And this is how biblical people think, or religious people think, I should say. I think that God just put this story in their head. But if that's so, it's incorrect. We know when you read the whole thing, it's not saying the exact same thing as what happened in history. So we can't use that as well. But it goes to show, since we know we got the Septuagint Greek, and that the Greeks wrote it because it's their history, it makes a lot more sense. Why would Hebrews even put that in their law? Because remember, the Torah is supposed to be their law, their story, their laws, the laws of Moses and what have you. Why is this Greek stuff in there? So this information is for you to help put together the pieces, for you to help put together these pieces. Because now when you start to listen to it, you can really see exactly what happened and how after Kemet fell, exactly what was going on and how they got into these positions. Now, I showed you before when I went to the Cairo Museum in Cairo, and now it makes a lot more sense when you go through that video and you see how, one, as I said, they tried to copy off of Kemet. You had Zeus Amon, you had Serapis, and we can see exactly what was going on. You can see how they start changing their culture into Egyptian culture with the stelas and everything else, dressing like the Egyptians and decreeing themselves as, pharaohs or what have you. Plain and simple. It's like so much corny, like a joke. It's embarrassing to me, if I was a Greek, to see them do that. Like, where is your own culture? And it's crazy how you have this Greek culture that's supposed to be so proud, and they got Zeus or what have you and everything like that. But as soon as they conquered Kemet, they took the Egyptian culture because they knew it was the truth. And they knew their culture was based off of Egyptian culture anyway, but they wanted to deal with the Egyptian knowledge and not their own. So they really tried to push their beliefs on the Egyptians in Israel to try to get those generations to take that information while they take the Egyptian information. They wanted to switch places. And this is basically what they have effectively done. When you pay attention to what's going on and how they do is, we have switched places. They took our knowledge and turned us into who they was, not having knowledge.